welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about art and design criticism. Let me try to set up this kind of strange episode for you. I am joined today by Jarrett Earnest. Jarrett is an artist and writer who in 2008 published a really incredible book that I love called What It Means to Write About Art, Interviews with Art Critics, where he talks to many of the best art writers of the last few decades about how they approach their craft. This is a book that probably immediately seems very interesting to many of you who like this show. And this was interesting to me for many reasons, beginning with just finding another Jarrett whose name is spelled the same way as mine. But where I am a designer and a writer, this Jarrett was an artist and a writer. And where I started this podcast to interview design critics about design criticism, Jarrett made a book to interview art critics about art criticism. I was intrigued not only with his project and how it came together, but also all the weird similarities between our work. And so in this episode, in many ways, it's kind of a meta episode. We talk about how and why we both interview people, how we both started writing, and what we learned from our respective projects. But this isn't just an episode about ourselves. This also turned into what I think became a really fascinating conversation about the nature of art, about how it moves in the world, and how we write and talk about it. We talk through the differences between art writing and design writing and what we want from each of those. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. Jarrett is an incredibly smart person who's really thinking about art in a deep way that I just really love and admire. His writing has appeared in publications like the Brooklyn Rail, the Village Voice, Vulture, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, and he's lectured and critiqued at schools around the country. I hope you get as much out of this conversation as I did. Don't forget, Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you. Through 2021, we'll be releasing new episodes every single week. So if you enjoy this show and want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter written by me, as well as previews of the upcoming episodes. This show, in many ways, and being able to release episodes every week this year is made possible because of your support. And so I can't thank you enough. For all the details to sign up, you can visit scratchingthesurface.fm/members. Thank you again for listening, and enjoy this conversation with Jarrett Earnest. Just for listeners, I just want to very quickly talk about the weird parallels in the two of us. And so you are an artist and a writer who essentially edited this book, put together this book called What It Means to Write About Art, where you interviewed people who write about art critics, about kind of how they do their job, about how they got into their job, about how they kind of think about criticism. I am a designer and a writer who interviews design critics about how they do their job, how they got into criticism, how they kind of think about writing. Your name is Jarrett, spelled Jarrett. My name is Jarrett, spelled Jarrett. There's just these like weird kind of connections between both of the work that we do. And so I'm interested in how you started the book. Where did this idea for to kind of interview critics come from, or what were you kind of interested in doing when you began that?
Well, to start, I also want to acknowledge that people are experiencing the convergence of like alternate reality selves. Um, I'm the art Jarrett, you're the design Jarrett. And similarly, while I have a lot of thoughts about criticism in general, and theoretically, I like the idea of design criticism. I have no real sense, and in fact, I'd like to write some. But, but I have no real sense of what that means in reality, like in practice. And so I'm hoping to learn from this conversation not only about your process, but about the kind of stakes of the design discourse now and how that might intersect, overlap, or diverge from
Mm-hmm.
some of the things that I sketched out in the book.
Yeah.
Uh, so how did I start doing it? I guess there's a lot of ways to answer that. The most straightforward way is I was always an artist and I went to art school. And when I got to art school, I was a painter, and I looked at the people who were painting and the people who were teaching painting, and I just thought, like, "These are not my people," like,
Mm.
"These people are dumb." Like, they don't read books, like,
Yeah.
the way that it was being taught and discussed was not interesting to me.
Mm.
I was interested in, ideas and whatever, and I still love painting. Painting's still probably my primary relationship to art. But, so I stopped painting. I didn't take any painting classes in art school. I started taking everything else. And through that, I had a teacher who was a poet and named Bill Berkson, who I included in the book. And he was like, "You've got all of these opinions. Why don't you try and write them down?" And I was like, I can't do that because 'cause I'm not a writer. I don't know how to write."
Right.
And he was like, "Well, you can just do it." And so he started helping me, or I would write something and send it to him, and it would be terrible, and he would help me, give me advice. And then I thought, "Okay, I graduated from art school. I wanna learn how to write." So I did something that was very, very naive, which was I applied to PhDs in art history because
Mhm.
I thought that, I read a lot of books and I love it and I love talking to people about art and ideas. And so, isn't a PhD in art history where those things happen? And I got there and very quickly realized that is not where they happen.
Mm.
And I wanted to learn how to write, and I wanted to think about writing about art as a really complicated thing. And so I was in a PhD program in New York for a few years, which was, utter misery, the worst experience of my life, not because it was hard, but because it was so stupid.
Okay. What
And
do you mean by that? What do you mean it was stupid?
I felt like the people that I was talking to didn't have any serious investment in art at
Oh,
all,
I see. Got it.
or
Mhm.
and that's where my desire to write came from.
Mhm.
And so I was like, "I'm not learning how to write. That's the reason I came here. There's no one who's asking interesting questions. When the dumbest conversations you have in your life about art is in a PhD program, that's a wake-up call."
Yeah.
So I dropped out, and my friends and a couple friends and I started a gallery in the Lower East Side, uh, that was called One to One. It was on Essex Street.
Okay.
And writing was so physiologically painful for me that I
Mhm.
had to invent a system to force myself to do it. And so I just made a rule that I had to publish something every month.
Okay.
And I was a really good talker. I was confident about my ideas, and I was confident about thinking and talking, but writing is not thinking or talking.
Mhm.
And so I started doing these interviews to try and bridge the gap, mostly with
Mm.
artists. And then it was a few years of doing interviews with artists, before I just by chance ended up interviewing a writer, which was Dave Hickey,
Mm. Mhm.
because we were both in residence together at the Rauschenberg Foundation, and I thought he was really brilliant, and I had always been told this was a bad guy. And
Mhm.
um, and so that's how it started. After interviewing Dave, I then started interviewing more writers about what they do, and it was really, I guess, in a way, it was like what I was looking for when I went to grad school, which was just like really serious. Every
Yeah.
person,
Yeah.
you would do a ton of research, and then you would have like a complicated conversation with them about their work.
I mean, look, I promise this whole conversation won't be like, "Oh, wow, look how similar we are." But, I mean, even your experience sounds so similar to my own in that when I was in design school and even more so working as a designer, felt like the conversations around the work we were doing were not interesting to me. Um, I like you was someone who is interested in ideas and interested in reading and in design, especially I was interested in how it actually lives in the world. And so when conversations around design devolve into whether one typeface is better than another typeface, or whether, this shade of blue is the right blue versus this shade of blue, I tune out. I can't do it. Um and and I then also was interested in writing, and people said, "Oh, you should write." And I said, "Oh, I don't know, I'm not a writer." And I have joked before that I am a podcaster in a way because I'm a failed writer because I like don't want to put in the work to to write as much, and that's where interviews came in for me. Also, can you talk more about this idea that you were interested in ideas and you like to read? I'm struck by that writing wasn't something that you were interested in before you had this teacher in school. If you were, kind of interested in all of this stuff already, how did that kind of intersection between kind of writing and reading come into your art practice?
Well, reading was always a huge thing. I was always a ravenous reader from the time that I was really small. And that's always been very, very natural. Like, it was a
Hmm.
long time for me before I realized that, like, reading comprehension was, like, a thing,
Hmm.
because I would just be like, "Oh, you read it and you understand what it means." It's like
Right,
it
right.
almost wasn't even until I started teaching where I was like, "Oh, like, we've gotta talk about what
Yeah.
it just actually means before we interpret it."
Yeah.
So I was very into reading, and I read a lot, and, it was like, but somehow that was never writing. I think that
Right,
writing
right.
is a level of abstraction that is different than other ways of communicating. Talking is provisional in the way that thinking is. It
Mm.
disappears at the moment that it appears, and you can change your mind in the middle of a thought, and it's okay. But with writing, you're really talking about something that's a form, and that it has a certain kind of stability. And even with the great writing, which has the experience, the illusion of this kind of fluidity of thought or speech, that's the product of really precise technical skill.
Right.
And, in a way, it's just like training. I didn't have the training. I never really was in a writing class. So I think that those things are really different.
I agree. And a phrase that stuck out to me when I was reading the book was when you were talking to Thriza Nichols Goodeve, and she referred to interviews as collaborative conversations. And I found that to be a kind of interesting term to think about interviews as a type of writing, or interviews, or conversation, even as a type of kind of, I don't know, elaborated speech or elaborated talking in some way. And I'm interested in how you thought about, I guess this is a two-part question, kind of what you think about that term collaborative conversations in your own practice and in kind of putting together the book. But I'm also interested in your process of structuring and editing these interviews. The book was much more casual than I was expecting. A lot of times when I read transcriptions of interviews, they become very kind of rote and here's a question, here's an answer. You put yourself into it, sometimes more so than others. Some conversations start the same way and then go somewhere where I wasn't expecting. How did you kind of think about the editing of the book and kind of the process of uh, having these conversations with these writers?
To start with what you were saying about Thurza, whom I really adore, I'm glad that you pulled that out of her interview. Describing interviews as collaborative conversations, because she herself is a writer who has done so many interviews that are really unique with artists and writers. And they're unique because I think not only is she so smart, but here's the thing, a lot of people are smart. Smart's not that big a deal,
Right.
actually. It's kind of like talented. It's like a lot of people are talented. I mean, a lot
Yeah.
more people are not talented, but it's a pretty big pool. And so what's special to me about what Thurza does is not only is she smart, but she's very human, and
Mm.
she knows how to connect the idea to a kind of personal to a kind of personal experience. And so I really admire her, and I feel like I learned a lot from her in that sense. Um, oh, but okay, so the thing about collaborative is I think everything is collaborative. And so one of the things that has become increasingly interesting to me as a writer is to move away from the framing, the isolation of like a single person or a single event as as the bearer of meaning, but rather to orchestrate them in such a way that you understand that they're in a very complex dynamic, which is collaborative. Like it's a collaboration with reality. It's a collaboration with their community. And in a larger sense, I think that that's what I tried to set up with the book as a form, is that you have all of these one-on-one conversations. So already you have this little dyad, but each of those dyads are put in context of 29 others that
Right.
create a world. And
Right.
sometimes those world, sometimes the people are talking about each other in the interviews, and sometimes they're in a completely separate reality. But I felt like bringing them together was a way of trying to say, like, none of these people are in this alone.
Hmm.
And so I think that that's one of the reasons why I love interview as a form. It's precisely what you're saying about the collaborative thing. Like things come up in these interviews because I'm me and they're them, and we're doing it on a particular day. If you did it on another day, if you did it
Right.
with someone else, it's going to be a completely different conversation.
Right.
And so when you talk about how much I've put myself into the interviews, I think that that was not only a way of being kind of honest, that like both the person I'm talking to and the reader can have a sense of like, who is this person that's asking these questions? But also it could allow the conversation to go into a new direction
Right.
by being very transparent about like what I'm bringing to the table.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. And I think about it the same way. And when I first started interviewing and when I started this podcast, I had never interviewed anybody before. And so I brought a microphone to my first interview and was like, we're just going to talk because I don't know how to do this. And that became the format for these because I didn't know how to. Oh, no, I still don't know how, nor do I think it's actually better to have this interview where I am some neutral bystander, because that's not true. And I think the way you've described it as more honest is exactly right. Something that I think is interesting in your book that you started to allude to is the wide range of people. You have people who are, kind of more academic thinking art historians. You have critics for newspapers and magazines. You have people who come from kind of fiction or poetry backgrounds. But my impression was these were all people who you really admired. You got a lot out of their writing. Even if you maybe disagreed with their views, there was something about them that you had this kind of way in this certain respect for. Can you talk about kind of how you picked the people that you picked to include, and the importance of having these people that might not otherwise be in dialogue, how you kind of decided that they should be under this one umbrella?
Yeah. Well, I think one part of that is sheer perversity,
Mm,
which is some of those people would never ever be brought up in conversation as being involved in the same
yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
And I think that that is really preposterous.
Mhm.
Um, Also, I think what you're saying is right. I mean, if you ever want to do a project that will just make a bunch of people mad at you, it's to do a book like this where you select a finite group of people, because every person that is not in the book um, is like slighted. And I
Right.
and I I wish I could report that art critics as a group of people were slightly more thick-skinned than that, but they're not. And
Yeah.
or whatever,
Yeah.
yeah. But I'm fine with people being mad at me. I think that's also a prerequisite for being like a real writer or artist. Is like, okay, people are going to be mad at you. That's kind of a good sign. So, but aside from that, it was a balance, because I felt like there were writers who were historically extremely important, and I wanted to capture a picture of who they were while I could. And a number of people that I interviewed have also died since then,
Mhm.
since the book has come out. And so, in a sense, that becomes more poignant. Um, the other part of it were people that I was interested in for whatever reason. And that doesn't
Mhm.
even mean that I like their writing. It just means that I
Right.
was interested in something that they did, a move that they had made, and I felt that they represented something. Of course, I mean, this book was 30 people, which like doesn't sound like that much until you're until you're like doing it, and then you're like, oh my
Yeah.
god, like doing these interviews, transcribing them, doing the preparation for them. I mean, it turned into a huge book. But
Yeah.
of course, there are 30 more people that I could easily rattle off and be like, "Oh, I would love to talk to this person," and, there are people that I regret that aren't in it, and but, I it's like a weird confluence between, like, one's individual, interests and then trying to meet that against the larger picture that you're trying to unfold.
Yeah, and one parameter that you did set, or it seemed that you set, unless I missed something, is that you did not talk to writers who also were continuing to be practicing artists, who had some sort of, were also known for some sort of art practice. You talked to many people who maybe started in art and then moved into writing. Was that a conscious decision, or what was your kind of thinking around not including, well known artists who happen to also, be, very great writers?
Well, I think that in a sense, the rules had to get very arbitrary. And
Yeah.
so, and it's funny, I'm kind of working on a little project that'll come out later in the year that is conversations with some artists who write, but I
Mm,
felt like if your primary status in the world was as an artist, that was a different thing, you know? And, it's like Amy Sillman, who is a great painter, just brought out a book of her criticism, and it's really fabulous. And, a number of people who write about art who are artists, it's some of my favorite writing because there is a kind of freedom in many cases. First of all, there's an embeddedness, like they care about what they're writing. They wouldn't write about it if they didn't care.
right.
And then there's a kind of freedom because they're not a writer. This isn't what
Mm,
they get paid
mhm,
to do. And so I think that with trying to put together the parameters of this book, which was just kind of anything that could help make it have a shape, I said, I can't really put in, poets, novelists, those are people who use language as a medium and they
mm,
think about it. In deeper ways necessarily. An artist thinks about words in an interesting way, but not necessarily the same way that a writer would. And so that's the only reason. I think it's kind of a lame reason, but I felt like I could have, I could do a book of 30 interviews with artists who write, and it would be fabulous. But it would be
yeah.
a very different book.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I asked the question because I'm kind of curious about your position in that. You mentioned that you studied painting and that you still, are very interested in painting. Do you see yourself primarily as a writer or primarily as an art? Like, where do you fall on that divide? And then also, where do you see this book kind of on that divide? Like, do you see this book as a artistic practice, like a gesture of artistic practice, or is this a book of criticism and of writing?
Well, I don't necessarily think it's important what we think about ourselves
Mm,
as much as what the culture needs from you and how you function within it. I think is
mm,
probably more quote unquote important. But if you're asking how I think about it, when I think about my essential self, I think of what I do as an artist.
okay.
And however, um, increasingly, I mean, I think of an artist in a very large sense. So I think of writers as artists, and I think of filmmakers
Yeah.
as artists. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
when I say someone is like an artist, I could say that about someone who does something in almost any form. But lately I feel like I've really connected to writing and language in a different way, and so I do also feel like a writer. Like I don't feel like a fake
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
writer.
Yeah.
I've never had the imposter syndrome thing that like whatever like Generation Z talks about.
Mhm, mhm,
Um,
mhm.
so yeah, I don't know. Like in this book, like, I think of this book as much as an artist project, as a writing project, but the truth is it's both. I
Right.
think that that's kind of the thing. It goes back to what you're saying about the collaborative conversation is that I think I'm really, trying on a lot of levels to get away from these kind of dualities,
Yeah.
and, which is funny given, like, how I just like talked about laying out the rules of like not artists who write, but
Well, I mean, that's why I asked the question because that was I felt that in the book, and I felt like that this was a book about writing. Also felt this was a book about art. I kind of, in reading interviews that you did about the book, kind of felt like you were kind of straddling both of those lines, that this was an artist book and this was also a book of writing. But then in the interviews themselves, so many people that you talked to enjoyed putting up uh, boundaries around what they do. This is, I am a historian, I'm not a critic, or I'm a critic, I'm not a historian, or what this person does, that's not art criticism. And I couldn't always tell where you fell on that. And the fact that kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, the fact that you had this wide range of people, my assumption was you kind of weren't interested in those boundaries. You're kind of just interested in writing and talking about art, and whether you call yourself a historian or a theorist or a critic, it almost doesn't matter. Is that kind of how you think about it?
well, I do think that it matters. However, I think that to enlarge this conversation to the present moment, and especially the present moment within the culture at large, but also the discourse of art and art history, is that we are at a moment where these categorizations are no longer operative.
Right.
They're not clarifying, and in fact, the distortions, particularly in a racist sense,
Mm-hmm.
are
Mm-hmm.
so transparent that we really have to rethink from the ground up. I do not think that there are a lot of tools that come to us from art history that are going to be useful for this work. Um, and I think that, probably art criticism as a category, as we knew it, I mean, when I said art criticism to someone in this book like Michael Fried, it meant a specific thing. Whatever he meant is not what it means now. And in fact, there might not even be art criticism in the future. There might not even be art criticism now, frankly. And so I think that that is, on one hand, kind of scary, I guess, if you're invested in institutional power, which I am not. On the other hand, it is really an exciting opportunity to think about something that's really complex and difficult. And the best way to begin that work is to try and dissolve the inherited thought patterns and distinctions, and then really look at them next to each other and say, look, put everything on the table. I have no fear that the art that I love and believe in is going to persist. Maybe we'll lose a lot of stuff too, but what we're doing is we're going to put demands on these things based on the needs of the moment and of the future. And so when we're doing that, like fighting
Yeah.
over like I'm a critic or I'm a historian, it seems pretty stupid to me.
Yeah.
And I guess that's part of the attitude that I think you're responding to, which was basically undercover in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I agree with that. And in the introduction to the book, you describe criticism as almost like a fiction. You say it's an embodiment of a worldview, and I'm curious. Maybe this is where we can start to kind of bring in design into the conversation a little bit more. Also, can you talk about what you mean when you talk about art criticism as a fiction? And maybe even relate that to this idea of like the role. That sounds so serious. Kind of what you're saying about how writing about art kind of fits into this current moment.
Well, I think if you start trying to get to a really basic definition of what an artwork is, I think you can't really get beyond it being something that like a human made for other people to look at and think
Mm,
about through looking at it or engaging with it in some way. And because otherwise, it could be any object in the world, and every object, can be an aesthetic contemplation can be brought to bear on anything. So it's
yeah,
like, what makes an artwork different than a salt shaker? Well, what
right.
makes a painting different from a chair? And I guess this is getting to the crux of the distinctions between design criticism and art criticism. Although I don't think so in a deeper sense, but in other ways, the way I'm phrasing it points into a rift there. But so what happens when you pay attention to an artwork in the elevated way that we pay attention to artworks is that you experience it, you notice things about it, you fit it into a story that you have about your experience of it. And that to me, and then if you're a critic, you write that story down. And that to me is as much a short story of like a personal short story as it is, an objective accounting of a painting. And the one way that you know that is that you can read writing about things over time and just see the difference of attitude and insight
Yeah.
and implication that emanate from the thing. I think, I was just reading a book on primitive mythology that was written in the 50s that was about the cave interpretations of the cave paintings.
Mm.
And the story that is manifesting, it's extremely erudite, is extremely grounded in the anthropology and sociology of its moment, and it is so of its moment, like what it the existential drama that unfolds in the cave painting. And I think that that's one of the things that's incredible about cultural objects is that they avail themselves um, e- to solicit, to hold those kinds of experiences over time, and then we can kind of check them between each other, and that's
Hmm.
actually like what makes a culture.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is interesting, and I want to lean into this part of the conversation about kind of kind of perhaps dissolving these boundaries or thinking about these things as separate in some way. I actually just wrote a essay a couple months ago that was just published, basically arguing that there's no such thing as design criticism, because in a way everything is kind of design criticism, because we live in a world that has been completely redesigned by humans in some way, and there's no escaping that. And so any type of cultural criticism is we can kind of think of that as design criticism because it was some sort of designed experience. And that for me has been a way to I have a series of questions here, and I'm going to try to break them down so it's not just me monologuing for a second. That to me has been a way to think about how we talk about design that moves it away from a purely aesthetic experience. And so, as a graphic designer, a lot of design writing, and I'm being reductive and I'm being a little bit overly simplistic here, but just for the sake of argument, a lot of design writing talks about, oh, here's a poster. Let's talk about the typography on it. Let's talk about the images on it. Let's talk about how big it is. And there's less discussion on how does this function in the world, or how does this change its world in some way. How does this create a culture? How does this include or exclude people? How does this kind of change a trajectory of something? That is a more interesting design discussion for me. I think we can kind of apply that to even things like apps and Facebook and social media and all this. How those are design questions in a way. We should be thinking about, when we talk about design criticism, we shouldn't be talking about like the design of the Facebook logo or the timeline. We should be talking about like how this is perhaps destroying democracy or something. And I'm interested in, are there, I'm going to show my ignorance in the art world. Are there parallels to those types of discussions? You talk to a lot of people in the book about kind of formal description and how that can also be a type of analysis. And I'm interested in this kind of intersection between talking about art from a purely aesthetic or formal basis versus kind of talking about a cultural context or kind of meaning. Um, and maybe I'm just asking you to kind of explain it to me as someone who's a little bit outside of that world. Does that make sense? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it does. I would say that the trend, I mean, first of all, the book that I wrote is kind of a 20th century book.
Mm,
And so there aren't young writers really. Um, and it's more of a portrait of a different moment. I think the writing that's happening now is all about subject matter,
yeah.
and it's not about what it looks like at all. And
Right.
so, that's scary to me because
Hmm.
I really care about what things look like. However, the I think one of the most kind of, and this is going to reveal my bizarro world Jarrett ignorance, which is one of the most like pejorative things that I could say about a show of someone's paintings, for instance, is that it's like design.
Mm. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's very often design that doesn't look good. So then like there's a double whammy there. But I guess so in that pejorative of me saying that a painting looks like design, I guess what I'm in my prejudice, what I'm saying is that it's purely operating at the level of form or decor, and there's no reason why it should exist. It doesn't tell me any story, not even it doesn't communicate to me any urgency of its place in the world. So I don't know why anyone would have made it. And so I guess like to me, when I dismiss something as being design, which is really obviously a joke, is that it seems to me like it's not engaging with some kind of larger purpose. However, the way that contemporary art and criticism is trying to get to that larger purpose is solely through the discussion of the subject matter of the art. This art is about X.
Hmm.
And we then evaluate the quality of the X. By the way, the X is always a good thing. The X is always something we really like. But there becomes this pesky problem, which is like, but is it actually a good artwork? Does it communicate the X through its embodied form in a way that is more subtle, uh, layered, complex, disturbing, beautiful, then I would imagine, given the equation, this artwork is about X. And the way that artworks do that is through the way that they're made, what they look like, and how they unfold that information to you in space and time.
I want to come back to that for a second, but I just have to talk about this like bizarro world thing for a second, because the same thing happens in design critique. And I teach in undergraduate and graduate programs, and I've seen critics come in and talk to students, and if a work feels too into itself, or too it doesn't have that kind of urgency, it doesn't seem like it's actually talking to the world. um People will say, "Oh, this is art. This is too art. This isn't design." And it's the same thing that you're talking about when you look at art and you're like, "Oh, this is design." And so it shows how there's this like weird disconnect between these two worlds that are actually very, very similar. And I think, you know, I don't know. I don't know how to talk about this in a way that doesn't start to put divisions between them. But it's almost like I want these two sides to come together in some way. I want design to have the urgency that art can have. Um, but then I also, you know what I mean? Like, how do we talk about that?
Historically, I think that those two things come together through architecture criticism.
Mm, mhm,
And
mhm.
notably, there were no architecture critics in my book.
Right,
Um, Originally those things were the same thing,
right,
art and architecture. They were the same department,
right.
and architecture and art were cohabitated. Like they were, sculptures only existed in relationship to architecture. Like paintings were made for the specific space of a chapel that they inhabited. So I think that you could look at the distinction as being one that follows the trajectory of modernism, maybe.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
um, or modernism as we experience it, in the 21st century as the whatever
Mhm,
abandoned dream.
mhm. I want to come back to this idea of kind of the formal or the aesthetic experience, and maybe how that kind of connects to what we were just talking about, because that to me is something I'm just asking you kind of selfish questions that I'm trying to work through in my own work right now. um, that to me is the hardest part. And even in this conversation, I've said things like, "Oh, I don't care about conversations about typography or about color," but that's not really totally true, because that
Yeah,
is,
of
that's
course.
what I actually learned, and
Yeah,
that's
the difference
that's
between this blue and that blue is actually kind of important.
yeah, yeah. And so like I say that as a way to point to the larger conversations that I am interested in, but I make it sound like I'm not interested in those others, even though I actually am. I just don't think the conversation should end with those, maybe is a better way to put it. And I'm interested in how you think about how you how you think about kind of writing about aesthetic experiences and using those aesthetic experiences to illuminate some larger story. And
Mhm.
so just to like maybe give something for you to kind of jump off of. I interviewed a couple years ago Elliot Earls, who's the director of the design program at Cranbrook, uh, and he said something that I think about often, where he talks about in criticism. The argument that the work is making, or the idea of the work is making, should be embodied in the form in some way. We should be able to read the argument in the work itself. I'm not sure if I totally buy that, but I like the idea of that, and I get some of that in your book when people talk about how description can be a type of analysis, or can in itself be a form of critique. Can you talk about that kind of intersection or relationship, or how the formal aspects of things, how it's actually made, does communicate the its urgency or the story that it's telling about the world?
Yeah. Um, it's not. I'm interested to talk about this because I do think it's the thing that is the most missing
Hmm.
in both on the level of writers and painters. Like I visit a lot of grad schools for painting, and so okay, you have to imagine as a critic, and you have to imagine you're a graduate student in painting. That means you've made a pretty serious decision to dedicate your time and thought to painting. And I'll look at paintings and it will be as though they've never looked at a painting before. And I'm like, who, what are you looking at? And they'll name paintings. And I said, when did you see those? Oh, I've never seen them in person. I've just seen reproductions. It's like, oh, okay.
Hmm.
That's what your paintings look like.
Right.
So the thing about the way something looks is that and that has to embody, and in a way what you're saying about this guy, it's very old school, but it's also very old school, and it's like also super corny, but it's so old school and corny that I actually think it's like really important now because
Okay.
it's like it's like been kind of like it's so missing from the way that people discuss art at present. And so what I really like is in the book, there's an interview with Michael Fried,
Hmm.
who is like a super, I mean, he kind of represents in the art history that we've inherited, like bad guy formalism.
Yeah.
He just, he's the Greenberg guy. He wants everything
Right.
to be like a stained canvas and da 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 da. And there's a beautiful conversation with him in this book about the limits of form and
Hmm.
description and how they're
Hmm.
interpenetrated. And he said, we were talking about a Caravaggio painting of Mary Magdalene and the extraordinary kind of emotional and psychological complex that it represents as a painting. And he says, well, if you are going to be a pure form person, where does it stop? Like, where does the information that you need stop? Like, do you have to know that it's Mary Magdalene? Do you have to know the Bible story? Do you have to know that it's a person? Like, what beyond it just being mineral pigment suspended in oil on a dirty cloth? Do
Right.
you have to be able to recognize it as terms of a cultural proficiency before it is, before you're not doing formal analysis? So I think that my feeling is that we have to have that kind of serious, rigorous engagement with form, but in its expanded context, in which all of that cultural and
Mm.
associated information, which is literally present in your experience of an artwork, can be acknowledged and can find its home in the form or attached to the form. So I think that the way that something looks, it's like a condensed version of um, of its concerns that expand with increasing like kind of diaphanousness out into the world, all over the world, sets of histories, associations, implications, and that through looking at the thing precisely the way it is and the decisions that produced it, you can then follow those threads, those trails out up into the larger world, back into time, back
Right.
into space. And so I think that the kind of attention, I don't know how that attention manifests itself in a broiler chair, for instance. Like I have ideas on how you would do it for like a broiler chair in particular, but like many chairs, I don't know.
Yeah.
And however, in the way, if you want to talk about a painting or a sculpture, which is the thing that I know pretty well, is that every single thing that you see was a decision and it has a history and it was done on purpose.
Right. Yeah. Which is
And
the same for a chair though, really.
yeah, just true. I guess the difference is probably like my proficiency in uh, the histories of the chair, like all of the decisions that were rejected in relationship to make the chair, because the chair has a pretty immediate goal, or it has at least it has the goal, which is like you've got to be able to sit in it. It doesn't fall over. Like it's the same with like architecture. Like the building has to not fall down. It has like a baseline uh, goal that it has to cross. With an artwork, the beauty of it, the thing that makes it so profound, is it doesn't have that basic goal. Like it doesn't, and that means that every single aspect, all the way down, it was is subject to a kind of interrogation or intervention at the level of its own existence in a kind of existential sense. And that to me is just intoxicating because then you get into questions about being itself.
That's so interesting, and that I mean that's very helpful for me. Also, going back to my grad students, I am not one of those people. I'm not one of those professors that is saying, "Oh, your work is art in some way." I'm like, if this goes into art, like let's talk about it as that too. But then it's always hard for me to talk about and to give feedback and critique because I don't have that side of it. As hard as I try, I'm still a designer, still thinking about. I can talk about this kind of functionally, um, and so I think that's really interesting. I'm going to just completely change the subject for a second because I want to go back to something that you said earlier when we were talking about why you didn't include practicing artists, and something that really struck me, and I must have known this probably subconsciously, but reading interview after interview it becomes really obvious how many of the art writers that we all know and look up to and admire are also poets or came from a poetry background, and just the amount of poetry in the book was amazing to me, and I'm just curious your thoughts on maybe why that is, or that kind of relationship between poetry and art writing, why so many poets are also just like kind of incredible art writers. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that there are two ways of answering that question. One is I think if someone else had done this book, there would not be that presence of poetry.
Mm,
I care about poetry, partly because the way I was introduced to writing about art was through a poet who wrote about art. And he introduced me into the lineage that he himself came from, which had to do with it was centered around Art News magazine in the 50s and 60s in New York that had a tradition of hiring poets. John Ashbery wrote art criticism there, James Schuyler, Frank O'Hara. And reportedly, I mean, the kind of quip in the book is, I mean, I think John Ashbery might say it, is that he likes poets because they know how to write and they don't have all this extra baggage. They
right,
can
right.
write about what they see. And at the moment of AbX, that was the dominant ideology of how you would engage with an artwork. It's like, what do you see? That's 20th century American abstraction. Can you push your ability to see what's there beyond the limit that you might think is even a limit that you don't even recognize that you have, and then tell the story of that. So that's basically a lot of abstract abstraction
Hmm.
criticism and it's fabulous. It's beautiful. Talk about it. Speculative fiction. It's these descriptions of how the blue and the red work against each other. On one hand, that's physiological because there is a real thing that a particular amount of red next to a particular amount of blue in specific shades calibrated can produce an optical effect. But with the ABEX, it wasn't about an optical effect. It was about an psychological, a spiritual, an existential effect. I mean, like a philosophical effect. And so I was hipped to this lineage of poets who write about art just by happenstance. But I love poetry. I've never and I love poets, and I'm very close to many poets. My partner's a poet. And so I think that in people that you wouldn't expect to have had a poetry background, I was especially attentive to that. And partly it's because um most people who are a lot of some writers in the book and most artists, they know they're artists as little kids. And that means that they experience their entire adolescence being self-conscious about it as, as an artist. And I think as a poet, and this comes out in Peter Schjeldahl's interview most beautifully, you recognize you have a special relationship to language as a child. And that means you think about language, all kinds of language, what your parents say, things on your report card, stop signs, whatever, with a different kind of attention. And so to me, that is really interesting when you start trying to understand the dynamics of writing and also the motivations of writing. Is that that deep apprenticeship to the language of the world is something that if you are a writer or a poet, you that's your education.
How did working on this book change how you think about writing, or more specifically writing about art? Like, how did this actually kind of change, whether that's like process, whether that's kind of how you look at art, whether that's how you kind of think about your job as a writer? How did you come out of this project differently?
You know, especially because it's like 2 years later, I'm like in a better position to think about the answer to that question. And what I really feel is that it almost like it was very freeing. It was almost like an exercise where it was like, okay, these are all the available, and this is the effect that I hope it has on people who read it, which is that like these are a bunch of people who found solutions for them and in their moment to write, and they're all different. And it gave me, I think, probably not like I ever needed more confidence, but a little more confidence to just do whatever I want. And it
Yeah.
means that like art criticism writing about art can be anything. And what we need right now is something different. I, as a writer, I think one of the things that I've always struggled with as a writer have to do with the traditional forms and limitations of criticism, which is, are you writing a review that like a 500 to 800 word review? Are you writing a feature? It's like there's something about the framing of that was never right for me. And basically, I guess after having done this book, it made me feel less like, okay, well, like I don't write those kinds of things. Like
Right.
just like go work on an essay for like a year and a half, and it'll be like 15,000 words, and it'll be like in a book, you know?
Yeah, I think freeing is such a great word, and a great way to describe it. And I honestly feel the same way in reading your book. I definitely think that comes across, and in me doing this podcast, I feel like it has opened up for me new ways of thinking about how to write about design, how to talk about design, what design even is. In some ways, it's and I hope that's the same for listeners too. Just to get really meta here. um, like you said, this is kind of a 20th century book. This is all people who are primarily older than you. I'm interested in who the writers are that you're interested in now, and maybe even kind of the issues that you're interested in both reading about and writing about yourself, that is kind of facing the art world. I guess I don't mean to use that word, but you know what I mean. That the art writers are thinking about now, or that you're thinking about.
Uh, well, I think that when coronavirus first started to happen, a lot of people in the art and media world started to have like a little mini crisis, like a midlife crisis, like
Mm-hmm.
whatever stage of their life they were in,
Yeah.
like a crisis of meaning. And I was like, yeah, good. You should have that crisis of meaning because what you do is irrelevant and like it doesn't matter. Like kill yourself. No. Um I was very hopeful because I thought like the both with coronavirus and then with the Black Lives Matter protests that were re-energized around the murder of George Floyd, I felt like wow, like finally we can get rid of so much that is superficial out of this
Mhm.
discourse. And people are going to be like, yeah, what am I doing with my life?
Right. Yeah.
And we could kind of like get out of it a kind of renewed urgency and seriousness and creativity because like no one's going to have jobs, so if you don't have a job you can decide what you want to do, you know. And then I guess what's happened in this slow normalization process or acclimatization is that it's just returned to like, you know, every article that I see that's written about art, it's just like so frivolous. It's so ridiculous. So now I think, you know, I think, ooh, not very excited about what's happening in art criticism, but also like, you know, it's I don't know. I think it's gonna have to be something different than it appear, you know? I really think there are people who, like, have jobs, and they're doing everything they can do to hold on to their job, and, and it's not even a good job, you know? It's
Yeah.
like, "Why are you doing this? Like, why are you debasing yourself?" So, I don't remember what the question was, but oh, it was like, "Oh, who gives me hope?"
Yeah. Yeah. Who are the writers that you're really interested in right now?
Wow, this is another thing where it's like you're just gonna get in trouble.
Well, like you said, by this point in the interview, no one's listening anymore.
Thank God. Um, you know, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question.
All right, how about I ask a question in another way that's maybe a little simpler?
Uh,
And this is a question that I ask everybody. What are you reading right now? What books are you reading right now?
oh my God. It's so ridiculous.
I love it.
I so I read a lot. And
I assumed as much reading your book.
yeah. So I read a lot and I follow the reading in a kind of organic way. So it's like I'll read something and then it'll make me read something else and
Hmm. Hmm.
make me read something else. And then I get on these kind of tangents that last, I don't know, for like a month and a half or something. So the tangent the tangent that I'm on now has to do with tantric art and
Okay.
different subsets of kind of ecstatic mystical Hinduism and the practices that relate to it in like Kashmir and Tibet. And so I read this book by Roberto Colasso called Ka, which was about Hindu myths, and I thought it was really fabulous. And so then I read the book that he wrote after that, just about Vedic hymns called Ardor. And then I read a book from the 70s on tantric art, and then I read a book called The Yoga of Power, and that which was this kind of Italian whatever fascist who wrote one of the first books on yoga. And then, you know, now I'm reading this Joseph Campbell book about mythology.
Mm. All right. I knew the Joseph Campbell book. I was completely unfamiliar with all the rest, but that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, you know, I would really recommend the Colosso Ka. If you've ever been curious about Hindu stories, it's very beautiful, and I think his limitations as a writer are completely obscured by the subject matter. You know, like the
Okay.
handedness, the like over intellectualism. It's like it works for the mythology.
Oh, interesting. All right. I'm making a note of that now. Uh, Jarrett, this was such a fun conversation for me. I enjoyed this so much. I feel like we could talk for another hour or so about this stuff. And of course, it's always nice to meet another Jarrett who's interested in similar things. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. This was great.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for calling.
This episode was recorded on September 30th, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.